send says oh okay. AwesomeeMan67 says hello everyone and welocme to another MC video. dr367 says sorry. AwesomeeMan67 says so in this video so we're gonna be playing Minecraft, we're gonna go mining with my new friend. dr367 says why did you pee? AwesomeeMan67 says okay. dr367 says okay. AwesomeeMan67 says let's take it into video. dr367 says you pee. AwesomeeMan67 says STF you stop typing in my intro. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says okay let's go mining. dr367 says SOR. AwesomeeMan67 says okay. AwesomeeMan67 says I see a cave. dr367 says that's a rabbin lil kid. AwesomeeMan67 says bruh. AwesomeeMan67 says it's a cave. dr367 says emerald. dr367 says we can make AEMRL stuff. dr367 says bro. dr367 says come OBR. AwesomeeMan67 says okay this cave isn't good. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. dr367 says EMR. AwesomeeMan67 says Emracled. dr367 says look. dr367 says stop. AwesomeeMan67 says bruh. dr367 says let me get it. AwesomeeMan67 says brop. AwesomeeMan67 says you're dumb. AwesomeeMan67 says stop. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says you are mining with X. AwesomeeMan67 says brew. dr367 says dude. AwesomeeMan67 says look. AwesomeeMan67 says you use pickaxe. dr367 says I was trying to mine it. AwesomeeMan67 says no wait. AwesomeeMan67 says you can't get it if you don't use pickaxe. AwesomeeMan67 says look. AwesomeeMan67 says GBOR. AwesomeeMan67 says what? dr367 says where is it? AwesomeeMan67 says IT literally lot dropped. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says what? dr367 says you dumb. AwesomeeMan67 says what is this? dr367 was slain by AwesomeeMan67. AwesomeeMan67 says BTO. AwesomeeMan67 says wait. dr367 says BTO. dr367 says what SBTO. AwesomeeMan67 says okay we have to find a new cave.
'Cause I don't wanna die. 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 'Cause I
AwesomeeMan67 says no mining straight down. DR367,000 says what? AwesomeeMan67 says it's a rule of MC, Minecraft. AwesomeeMan67 says go up. AwesomeeMan67 says you're in a fallen lave. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says you are still going down. AwesomeeMan67 says bro you're in a fall lave. DR367,000 says no not BTO. AwesomeeMan67 says yes. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. DR367,000 says bro. DR367,000 tried to swim in lava. AwesomeeMan67 says you are so dumb. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says we're literally so bad. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says DR367,000 says literally bro. DR367,000 says W. AwesomeeMan67 says okay bruh. AwesomeeMan67 says get new stuff. DR367,000 says TW. AwesomeeMan67 says okay we're back. DR367,000 says okay. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. DR367,000 says P. AwesomeeMan67 DR367,000 says no. AwesomeeMan67 burned to death. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. DR367,000 says stupid. AwesomeeMan67 says okay let's go. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. DR367,000 says wait. Awesome man 67 says I literally got in lay vegan. Dr367 says I can cook it. Awesome man 67 burned to death. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says okay. Dr367 says I build some tike so you ... Awesome man 67 says goodbye. Awesome man 67 says THX. Dr367 says WY. Dr367 says why is Patrick here? Dr367 says he's upside down. Awesome man 67 says TFB Patrick. Dr367 says Patrick scare pats. Awesome man 67 says bro what? Dr367 says you so bad. Awesome man 67 says we're bad. Dr367 says hey. Dr367 says I have a cool magic trike. Awesome man 67 says no. Dr367 says stand right here. Awesome man 67 says bro. Dr367 says lels. Awesome man 67 says I am on have a here. Awesome man 67 says EMS. Awesome man 67 says okay. Dr367 says why is the iron green? Awesome man 67 says bro it's him. Awesome man 67 says emerald. Dr367 says oh. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says like in BW. Dr367 says oh. Awesome man 67 says, hypixel bedwars. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says okay. Dr367 says I thought that was being sponge. Awesome man 67 says bro okay I'm hungry. Awesome man 67 says come here. Awesome man 67 says I not have food. Awesome man 67 says give me. Awesome man 67 says all. Dr367 says Gene joking. Dr367 says ha 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 ha. Awesome man 67 says all chicken raw chicken. Awesome man 67 says no that's like last year. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says give all raw chicken. Awesome man 67 says give. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says you are ally only has raw chicken. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says okay. Awesome man 67 says whatever. Awesome man 67 says you are so low. thou send says E. Awesome man 67 says slow. Awesome man 67 says stop. Awesome man 67 says bro what is news. Awesome man 67 says bro. DR367 thou send says himself. Awesome man 67 says look at my hunger. Awesome man 67 says it's green. Awesome man 67 says I have hunger. DR367 thou send says it's emerald. Awesome man 67 says BRTO. Awesome man 67 says what is wrong with you. DR367 thou send says emerald. Awesome man 67 says you literally give me raw chicken, you are literally FUDM. DR367 thou send says emerald. Awesome man 67 says you make me sick MC. DR367 thou send says no. DR367 thou send says it's emerald. Awesome man 67 says and I not even have 999 hunger back. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says I still hungry. Awesome man 67 says bro. Awesome man 67 says or literally dumb. Awesome man 67 says YK what? Awesome man 67 says FKU. Awesome man 67 says FKU. DR367 thou send says wait. DR367 thou send says E. DR367 thou send says stop. Awesome man 67 was slain by DR367 thou send. Awesome man 67 says BGRO. Awesome man 67 says come here. Awesome man 67 says come here. Awesome man 67 says jump in lane. DR367 thou send says OTE. Awesome man 67 says jump in the lave to get back NOPW. Awesome man 67 says now. DR367 thou send says can I cook chicken first? Awesome man 67 says no. Awesome man 67 says DYMC. DR367 thou send says bro. DR367 thou send says it's not tier anymore. DR367 thou send tried to swim in water. Server, made awesome man 67 a server operator. DR367 thou send says what? Awesome man 67 says okay. Awesome man 67 says wait. DR367 thou send says I got the market. Awesome man 67 says okay. Teleported awesome man 67 DR367 thou send. Awesome man 67 says okay. Set on game mode to creative mode. Awesome man 67 says okay. Awesome man 67 says Ursabel I'm craving. Awesome man 67 says critical. Awesome man 67 says I'm in poor baby. DR367 thou send says wait. DR367 thou send says what's happening. Awesome man 67 says BGR, not what I've seen in the lobby. DR367 thou send says what is this people? Awesome man 67 has made the advancement hot stuff. DR367 thou send says she says it girl people turned to oil. DR367 thou send says what? DR367 thou send says pretty bad. DR367 thou send says like. DR367 thou send says chicken zombie from Minecraft Minecraft. DR367 thou send says what's. DR367 thou send says whatever. DR367 thou send says what's happening. DR367 thou send says why am I living in the beans. Awesome man 67 says see what hey pen. Awesome man 67 says so I lava you but you heal so you not decline. Awesome man 67 says so pain 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 forever. DR367 thou send says BTO. DR367 thou send was slain by Awesome man 67. AwesomeeMan67 says bro you D1. AwesomeeMan67 says DR367,000 was smashed by AwesomeeMan67. AwesomeeMan67 says I Kyle you. DR367,000 says stop. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says no. DR367,000 says can you steal me grammar time? AwesomeeMan67 says you betray me. AwesomeeMan67 says you give me. AwesomeeMan67 says watch me. DR367,000 says from SUV, steal a brain root. DR367,000 was smashed by AwesomeeMan67. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. DR367,000 says made by Spider Sammy. AwesomeeMan67 says noon play. AwesomeeMan67 says that anymore. AwesomeeMan67 says THTRS from like a long time ago. DR367,000 says why is you not dying? DR367,000 says I am a go mining hit. AwesomeeMan67 says he wants half mining. DR367,000 says I'm mining. AwesomeeMan67 says you in always pain but you not die cause I heal you. DR367,000 says cool. DR367,000 says bro. DR367,000 says stop. AwesomeeMan67 says we're not friends anymore BTW. DR367,000 says I am a crash out. AwesomeeMan67 says die down TRHT. DR367,000 says cuz. DR367,000 says you're hiding me. DR367,000 says and heal me. DR367,000 says cuz. DR367,000 says I am trying to mine. AwesomeeMan67 says yes crash DR367,000 says N. DR367,000 says it's N-wing. DR367,000 says stop. AwesomeeMan67 says you are not my friend and why more. DR367,000 says well we not friends anymore. DR367,000 says Estrada. DR367,000 says stop. DR367,000 says I play grow garden. DR367,000 says N. DR367,000 says I am beater. DR367,000 says cuz. DR367,000 left the game. AwesomeeMan67 says bro. AwesomeeMan67 says WR